noteworthy for being overkill. Admiral Talon flipped through several pictures on the large projected screen behind him. The Battle of Yavin 5. Humans called it light bombardment. The picture behind him depicted 5 battle cruisers in orbit, all simultaneously firing orbital artillery toward the terrorist stronghold known as the Keep. Over 2 megatons worth of ordnance were dropped on a 50-square-mile area. When questioned about the severity of their methods, human ambassadors frowned in confusion and stated, "That's just the nature of orbital fire support." A screenshot of a human news website flashed behind the admiral. The bombardment was so trivial that it was little more than a footnote under a footnote titled, "Human Volunteers Aid in Peacekeeping Operations." For those who were not alive 100 years ago, the Keepers of the Sacred Word, as they called themselves, were the most dangerous terrorist cell the galaxy had seen in over half a century. To the humans, they were little more than a fly to be swatted. One of the most infamous pictures of all time was the next to be presented on, a human soldier onlooking the ruins of the entire city of New Calanti. A small armada of frigates lingered over the city's smoldering corpse while blasting autocannon fire at anything that dared peek its head out of the rubble. Despite all of this destruction, the soldier appeared to be entirely relaxed. Her rifle was swung over her shoulders, and she rested lazily against a tree. It is reported that this lone human soldier had been part of the first wave of drop troopers to make landfall around New Calanti. According to both human and independent reports, the soldier managed to kill at least 57 enemy combatants single-handedly before being evacuated from the surface. Shortly after this photo was taken, the entire city of New Calanti and everything within a 200-mile radius of it was turned to glass by nuclear warheads. A picture of a human lawyer in court appeared on the screen. The Galactic Council tried to try the humans for war crimes. The human lawyer pointed out 2 things that were enough to get the trial dismissed immediately. 1, the Galactic Council themselves called upon humanity to deal with the Calantian issue. And second, several deadly viruses were released from the New Calanti Biological Research Facility in an attempt to drive off human forces. The lawyer put it best, arguing that humanity was faced with the prospect of losing a city or losing an entire planet. We chose to destroy the city before it could destroy itself. Admiral Talon took a long drink of water before continuing. I'd like to remind all of you that humans glassed New Calanti as a concession. Humans originally claimed that they planned on glassing the entire continent and quarantining every system in a 15-light-year radius to prevent the spread of whatever diseases the Calantians had cooked up. Not even that plan was considered overkill to human command. It was at this moment the crowd began to rustle. One young officer even raised her hand to interject. After a quick nod of appreciation from Admiral Talon, the officer began, "If 15-light-year quarantine wasn't considered overkill," the officer audibly gulped and faltered slightly. "What was?" Admiral Talon let out a chuckle as he changed the slide behind him. "If only we knew." Once more the room fell into disarrayed whispers of disbelief. The Admiral looked around the room while still chuckling. Quarantine of 100 light-years was proposed as an extreme but reasonable course of action. Instead of mutterings, the room fell into a stunned silence. Sensing that he'd recaptured their attention fully, the Admiral continued. This exchange served as a warning to the galaxy at large that humanity would see taking ludicrous courses of action as perfectly sane and reasonable. Because of this, we ramped up our surveillance on human projects substantially in the following years, decades, and as of now, centuries. What we have revealed is certainly insane, but also incredibly revealing. The pictures changed rapidly and varied wildly in scope and scale. Photographs of diplomats, engineering projects, battle fleets, corporation logos, government insignia, backroom deals, the whole 9 yards. What you are about to be informed of is highly classified. Anyone leaking it will face court-martial and very possibly execution, but it is critical that you see this information just to see the nature of the beast that is humanity. Once more, pictures swapped randomly, until eventually a video began to play. The dim lights in the gargantuan meeting hall darkened completely. What was being displayed on screen was nothing short of monumental. Subtitles displayed. A large grouping of human military assets is seen amassed near an anomalously large hypergate. The camera zooms and pans for a better view. The number of visible human warships is 11,127. GIA Officer 1. You ever see a battle group that large? GIA Officer 2. In a history book. The hypergate begins to activate. GIA Officer 1. Holy shit, you seeing that? The star the hypergate orbits begins to darken as its energy is drained. The camera begins to zoom into the center of the hypergate. GIA Officer 2. Zoom the camera more in on that. That can't be right. GIA Officer 1. I've already run the diagnostic twice. What we're seeing is real. The gate is connected to a galaxy. Analysis confirms it is not the Great Band Galaxy. GIA Officer 2. Get Overlord on the line now. The situation's changed. End of video. Admiral Talon didn't delay on elaborating. Humanity has always been alien in action, belief, and capability, but now it is known that they are truly alien in origin. Further intelligence gathering reveals that humanity is an intergalactic force of nature. They exert total control over at least 27 galaxies. They are present in at least 1,722 galaxies in some form. Some estimates place them at over 10,000 galaxies under their influence. Picture after picture of galaxy, megastructure, superfleet, megacorporation, politician, and scientist flashed on the screen. There was so much information that several officers in the crowd were growing lightheaded. What we are dealing with is a Type 3 civilization 100-fold. To them, 1,000,000 stars is little more than a drop in the bucket. 100 light-year quarantine isn't even an inconvenience. It's just business as usual. The next slide that came on made everyone in the room, the Admiral included, wince. It was a map of the aptly named Great Rift of Althor. Just 10 years ago, the Great Rift opened. It swallowed with it an entire star cluster. It took the combined efforts of 157 species, humans included, to stop the lethal radiation from sweeping across an entire grouping of 15,000 stars. The next slide sent the room into a state of pure uproar. Admiral Talon had to wait an entire minute before his calls to order were even registered by his officers' panicked minds. Silence. The room fell into quiet terror at the sight before them. You are looking at what the humans consider overkill. This is the last picture received from Althor itself before the rift consumed it. A hypergate channel from human space to Althor. The officers lost all professionalism and began to roar in outrage at once. Why would the humans do this? We considered them allies. We're doomed. God help us all. How could it be possible? The uproar was quenched instantaneously upon the arrival of the next image. A horribly disfigured being, obviously screaming in unimaginable pain, was plastered on the projected screen. Within the Althor sector was a plague. All it took was one carrier of the disease to decimate an entire planet. The Council monitored the situation for months. In the span of the last 10 days preceding the rift's opening, 273 planets went entirely dark. The humans saw the problem, and even they feared it. We begged them for help, and that was their response. On display was a quasar, an active supermassive black hole, with gargantuan constructs channeling its energy into a beam of pure annihilation. This human hyperweapon is the most destructive device the universe has ever seen. They've harnessed the power of the quasar, focused it further, and used it in times where overkill is truly necessary. More pictures and information of the disease appeared on screen. Humans call it the Scourge, a disease they've unfortunately encountered in galaxies other than our own on several occasions. I say with great certainty that it is the only thing I've ever known to make a human admiral queasy with 100% certainty. Admiral Talon surveyed the room for a good long while before concluding his brief. I'm sure you are all now wondering what to do with this information. Unfortunately, I can only say that this information is purely useless to all of us. We exist at humanity's whims and could be eradicated just as easily. My final wisdom to all of you is this. Humans have proven time and time again to be nothing if not helpful. They show no signs of undue aggression, form treaties, broker peace. They check all the boxes of a civilized species. What I'm telling you is, under no circumstances go against the grain with humanity. They know best and have enough firepower to make us see or blind us with it should they see fit. Standard practice to them is apocalypse to us. Overkill to them is annihilation to the whole universe. What I'm telling you is don't bring a cruiser to a quasar fight. In short, don't piss the humans off. The shuttle landed gently on the ground, hard steel squashing gentle blades of grass as it began to offload its troops. 2,000 Gracanti, ape-like with 4 arms and heavy legs, all clad in traditional armor. They rapidly marched out of their transport and stood to attention in their ranks for their 14 officers. This was one of many rites of submission the Great Compact allowed. Humanity, a new species, a new race, new faces in the universe, had been brushed aside by the Compact as a backwater barbarian race owing to their internal strife. So many of the empires and great nations invoked the right of submission, a right where the locals would be challenged to a duel between 2 warring forces. The process was simple. A war would take place that would have 2 static units engaging in war over territory. No more than 10,000 men per side would be allowed to commit to the conflict. The loser would permanently forfeit any claim to the system, but could invoke against any other system to try their luck again at any time. Even the homeworld could be invoked. If the defender loses the battle, they would immediately abandon all operations and leave the system. If they refused, the entire compact would attack them and wipe them out. It was easier and simpler than mass genocide or outright warfare, and costed less lives and resources. It was a system that worked, and to make it fair for local primitives or other such civilizations, the rite would be conducted on their own home turf to give an advantage. The Gracanti were expecting an easy victory as they massed on a small island archipelago on the human world Taranth VI, a jungled world surrounded by volcanoes and dense brush. This would be easy, not only because a jungle was their own natural element, but also due to a technological advantage they had. Plasma pistols and laser cannons would be all too easy to defeat the humans' primitive pulse rifles and projectile weapons. After all the troops disembarked and waited for their barked orders, they stood to attention, checking weapons. A bright red flash of light in the sky from a large flare signaled the start of the rite, and the general began a speech. All present puffed their chests with pride and held their heads high. This would be an easy victory, they thought. Their sensory gear could pick up no movement anywhere or see anything nearby. The general stopped in his tracks, let out a soft moan of pain, then collapsed dead on the ground. A soldier broke ranks and attempted to provide aid only to find a small hole in the back of the general's head. Green blood now stained his hands. He screamed out they were under attack, just as his squad captain let out a small squishy noise, splattering blood on the poor sod behind him, then fell to the floor, dead. Panic gripped the unit as they sprinted for cover and began looking for targets, only to find none. A few moments passed with naught but silence. No more deaths, no nothing. One officer poked his head out to check for anything and instantly died as a bullet went into his eye. The group began to panic fire into the trees on the mountain to try cover. 6 more men died from bullets, each one a perfect shot right to his head. Even though these men wore helmets that easily deflected shots in most cases, the bullets just pierced straight through. The panic fire continued for a bit longer, and a few officers braved the firing line, calling to stop. A few tense moments followed, and no more death happened. The officers rallied their troops and sent them into the trees. They found nothing. No ammunition, no tracks, no traces. Most of the soldiers ran into the jungle and experienced an eerie silence with not even birdsong in the air. Nothing but the quiet hum of the wind and the soft rustling of leaves. To secure their way back, a squad of 50 men guarded the transports. A retreat meant a loss, but a loss could be learned from. There were 50 transports, all of them in the air, hovering gently a few feet above the ground, and a squad of 200 to guard them. A loud thud was suddenly heard in the distance, shortly before one transport was instantly destroyed, going up in a massive fireball. A few of the men nearby were incinerated or blown back by the explosions. Seconds later, another impact blew the engine clean off another transport, causing it to spin uncontrollably, taking out 2 more transports in the process as it crashed into them. Panic gripped the men on the ground as 2 more transports were hit, one of which landed on a screaming officer who was unfortunate enough to be trying to calm his troops down in the precise wrong spot. Suddenly, mass explosions and random detonations began occurring in the mountain. The unit of 200 sent to scour the mountainside was now panicking, firing wildly into the trees as they suddenly detonated, legs and arms suddenly being severed. Now, beset on two fronts, the transports were easy prey, and one shell perfectly hit the cockpit, killing the pilot who slammed it into the ground, crushing a squad of 6 men. By the time any officer had collected himself enough to give any orders, the mountain unit was all dead or dying, and only 13 of the 50 transports were still flying. An order to retreat was given, and the transports fled. As they ascended into the sky, a streak of smoke suddenly emerged from the mountains surrounding them. Every transport was hit with a missile strike that came out of nowhere. First 5, then 8, then 10 missiles, each aiming for a transport, streaked across the sky. No transport survived the attack, and now the army was stranded, trapped fighting an enemy they didn't understand, nor could even see. The officers wisely assumed that the mountains had traps or other such means to dissuade attackers. The only real road through was the roads. This was a bad idea, as the officers later found out. Smartly, however, they ordered their men to stagger formation and space themselves to defend against explosive attacks like those seen in the mountains. The force was now stranded and had lost a total of 300 of the 2,000 men. They still had plenty of strength and carried on. The army marched on. A group of 400 or so crossed a long bridge leading to the larger island in the archipelago chain. This army was just about to cross a bridge when a massive explosion rocked the front and rear simultaneously. The bridge at both ends suddenly collapsed, trapping the army where it stood. They collected themselves quickly and began to look for any trace of their targets. Nothing. The 2 officers that were there hid carefully, using their soldiers as cover. The army was now trapped 200 feet in the air on a bridge over a raging river. Any man who fell in the river was condemned in those merciless rapids if they aren't crushed by the falling bridge or killed by the explosion. 2 more explosions suddenly racked the column, again at both ends of the bridge. Then 2 more explosions again at the same point, the north end of the bridge collapsing. The south end of the bridge collapsing after a 3rd explosion. An officer was about to give an order when an explosive shell landed directly on his head, detonating such that any soldier not caught by the blast was splattered with fragments of his bones and armor or splattered with a shower of his blood. 2 more explosions, followed by a further bridge collapse, marked the end of the bridge army, as the last 2 segments of the bridge collapsed, condemning all to a watery or messy grave. That one failure marked the death knell. With only 4 of its original 14 officers, and only had 1,300 of its original 2,000. Still plenty of strength. An army of 200 marched south from the bridge and made their way through what looked like an industrial area or some kind of logging storage yard. They spotted movement in the camp and charged forth, firing wildly as both a cover for their advance and a means of intimidation. They went in and gathered around a strange idol. It was a strange ape-like creature, or at least a faux approximation of one, sitting on a box while holding 2 strange circular metal devices. It appeared to be a children's toy of some kind. The army carefully scanned the local area and found nothing but this strange idol. One soldier, seemingly out of curiosity, picked up the toy and it began to emit a shriek and banged its metal objects together, making a ringing noise. The toy had a string attached to it, and as it was picked up, a whir, then click noise was heard. As the soldier looked at the string, he realized the monkey was sitting on a box of explosives. Demolition charges placed at key locations all across the yard suddenly detonated. Any man that was left alive began to panic and run, followed by being quickly shot and killed by a bullet from nowhere. 200 men died. 3 officers left. An army of 400 moving towards an outpost seen from the skies. A long road towards it. Every few paces the army took, 2 or 3 men would receive a bullet and fall dead. The army would stop, raise their rifles. Someone would open fire at the sight of movement, and then after a barrage of fire would stop. Sudden ambushes from the trees of automatic gunfire would spray the road down, killing a few men, then suddenly stop. Remaining soldiers would run up into the mountainside or the jungle and find nothing. A few of the men sent to investigate would not return to formation. A slow whittling of troops as they approached the outpost had them broken. And fearful, the officer in charge, barely capable of keeping his men together, was out in the open. He realized this too late, as his head suddenly disappeared in a shower of bone and blood. With the officer dead, there was nothing stopping the army from panic firing wildly before their forces were hit by a series of explosions seemingly from above. There were no aircraft to be seen, and no enemy could be found. As the army was whittled down, one man was all that was left. It was here the first human warrior was seen. He emerged from the jungle and approached the Gracanti holding an automatic rifle. It was a human, wearing green armor that looked like fabric, with the only metal in his armor being interwoven plating around his chest and the helmet on his head. The Gracanti, still in a panic, tried to open fire, only to realize his rifle's plasma charges were spent from his wild firing. The human approached, getting within spitting distance, and aimed his weapon, emptying the ammunition clip into the Gracanti warrior. Then, with a sadistic smile, vanished back into the trees. An army to the west, a force of 300, met a sudden and messy end as they encountered a human military vehicle. A single military vehicle met them in an open field. An ugly, boxy-looking thing on primitive tracks with a single turret-mounted gun. Officers were unnerved by it. Its gun was strange. It had 8 barrels that spun around. On registering a threat, the vehicle charged at them and began firing. The army had fallen into a perfect trap, and the vehicle's gun began spraying thousands upon thousands of rounds into the army's forces and slaughtering every man there. Plasma weapons fired at it would be too slow, and the vehicle's speed would allow it to ignore them as it moved. The armor plating was mirrored or polished, so laser fire would bounce off it harmlessly. The battle lasted barely 2 minutes as the machine flanked the army and hit their broadside. An army of around 100 had come across terrain too difficult to traverse and had fallen back to their entry point, only to find a smoldering graveyard of their comrades. Incensed by this dishonor, they moved west to the bridge. Their existence was short-lived. A few strange, cylindrical objects suddenly appeared at their feet and began to spew out smoke, obscuring their view. A scene of terror and horror followed, making men panic and run. The sight of a human using a device known as a flamethrower was a scene reminiscent of their ancient history of a god of hatred and vengeance that plagued them millennia ago. The sight caused many to flee, only to be immediately killed by a bullet from the blue. Those that stood their ground or failed to run in time were engulfed by a blazing inferno that scorched their skin and boiled them in their own armor. Seeing that the world in the open was a means of death, the last 300 men carefully made their way through the terrain and tried to avoid the roads and open areas. 100 of those men fell prey to random bullets from nowhere, traps in the trees or terrain pits. The last remaining officer in the group hit a pitfall trap, and the soldiers with him panicked and fled into the trees as they saw him face up in the trap with his body turned into a literal pincushion. The remaining 200 or so were picked off by snipers or fell prey to traps and mines. By the time it was over, a group of 10 were left, 10 out of 2,000. Those 10 were now cowering in fear in the middle of a field. One soldier, seemingly now insane, called his enemy to show themselves, fight like real warriors. Their panicked firing had expended all of their ammunition, and they only had blades to fight now. They towered over the humans, though, so it meant nothing. They would win. The soldiers stood in a circle and taunted their enemy to show themselves. A sudden spray of blood showered one soldier as 9 of the 10 men suddenly dropped dead from a bullet. The remaining soldier screamed in rage and terror as he frantically wiped his face clean of his brother's blood. He screamed at the locals to show themselves, daring the humans to face him in combat. He heard a rustling noise, and suddenly 24 humans appeared seemingly out of nowhere. Each was wearing a selection of bushes and face paint, making them blend in perfectly in the brush. Each one armed with a high-caliber weapon. Before the soldier could do anything, a bullet blew one of his kneecaps off, severing his left leg from his body. He writhed in pain for a few moments before one human came up to him with a large-caliber pistol and finished him off. The Gracanti Armada present in the system recorded the entire event and frantically turned tail. As the ships moved, they screamed in terror as they realized that humanity's navy had deployed a massive array of limpet mines directly in their path while they were distracted. As each mine, a kiloton-level nuclear warhead magnetically attached itself to each hull 100 times over, a message was sent on an open comm. Pity the poor little children who think fancy guns and big ships make them strong. Make sure you tell the galaxy what happened today. We will be waiting for them, and we will leave no witnesses." The limpet mines detonated, obliterating the entire armada. The only vestiges of the Gracanti starship fleet disintegrated into pieces of nothing but slag and wreckage. The only survivor was a barely functioning frigate that only took one hit from the detonation. Humanity let it escape. For what reason, the galaxy would never know. The galaxy saw the recording. The compact forbade any future rights against humanity and forbade traitors from their space. Many armadas and starship fleets endeavored to try to gain vengeance and retaliate. These fleets were never heard from again. Humans were fairly new to the galactic stage at the point of the dispute about planet X-23A. This planet had been claimed by two different species, the humans and the Galath. The Galath were a fairly old species, but extremely militaristic. The Galath were strange in the idea that they were a hive mind, not exactly uncommon, but they had multiple queens who ruled with a sort of democratic system amongst each other. The humans were different from what we had heard of them, although it wasn't much. They were very secretive. They wore bulky suits and rarely ever took them off. In fact, human space was heavily quarantined for being a very deadly environment. It seemed that we Hookums could live there if we wanted to, as long as we were in gravity suits to help compensate for the crushing gravity. The humans also shared our body shape, more or less being bipedal and having a head in the top of their body. They sounded similar enough to us, but a lot smaller. We had been invited on the bequest of the Galath to talks on what to happen with the planet. I think they thought we would side with their claim because of the fact we had long-standing trade connections, and they were part of the alliance that freed our species from what we called the abductors. Since then, we had risen to the most powerful and technologically advanced species in the whole galaxy. "The human ship is requesting to dock," one of the men said. "Tell them to dock in Shuttle Bay 9. Their ship is small enough to get in there." The Galath had already arrived and were actually docked on the side of our ship, the Hertol, and were impatiently waiting in the conference room. I took the turbo lift to the conference room. Unfortunately for us, we would have to keep on spacesuits to breathe, as we had flooded the room with gases and placed a wall to divide the room into two so two gases could be used, which we were not accustomed to, although the humans did come close, but with far, far too much oxygen. I stood in the room with the Galath ambassador, "Many sons," he said, a Galath standard greeting. He looked as if he was staring off into the distance, and I knew I was talking to one of the hive minds directly. "Greetings, Your Majesty," I replied. He simply grinned. The hive mind must have found this amusing and turned away. Then the humans came in. They wore their armor, each with a different symbol on their shoulders and different colors on the armor. I thought these symbols looked oddly familiar. "Hello," one of the humans said. He had a deep voice which was exaggerated, no doubt, by his suit. "I am the representative of the European Union. This is the representative of the British Solar Empire, the North American Union, and the Russian Space Federation," he said, pointing to each in turn. Why had they sent 4 representatives? I wondered maybe they were still a nation-state species. The talks began. The humans seemed oddly cunning, reminding me of our own species. Indeed, I couldn't see their faces, and they couldn't see my own, which made it hard to read facial cues. However, whenever I threw some political nonsense, that only ever applied to these situations. At them, they seemed completely versed in this, as if border disputes were a regular occurrence to them. "I'm sorry to interrupt," I said, not really as the human in a red suit from the British Solar Empire had been rambling on about border laws flawlessly. "But you can remove your helmets. We had specially conditioned the atmosphere in your room to be similar to your own world." They looked at each other. "We would prefer to keep them on," the North American Union representative said. "I insist," I said back. "We did take a long time to sort it out." This was an utter lie. It took 10 minutes in reality, but we had been talking for 3 hours now, and I wanted even a small win. I was stunned by what I saw look at me. The British Solar Empire representative had taken his helmet off. In fact, it was a she, but that wasn't what shocked me. They looked like us. Nose in the right place, eyes in the right place, ears, mouth with pink lips, pale skin, and blonde hair. The Galath had seen it too. What trickery is this? He growled through his sharp, scaly snout. These are your children, not the humans. I'm sorry, what? The EU delegate asked. I can assure you this is no trick, Crocodile. A what? The Goloth said angrily. He and his assistant got up and walked out. I knew this was bad. This was essentially one of their queens, after all. The humans looked annoyed and were getting ready to leave. Wait, I said quickly. Would you mind waiting here for a while? 30 minutes, one of them said, not looking too pleased. I practically ran down the halls towards the doctor's office. Joko, he smiled. What can I? No time, I panted. Follow me. Now we were both running until we got to another office titled Xenobiology June, I said. Follow me. Now 3 of us were running, 2 looking very confused. The atmosphere in the conference room on our side had become habitable to us again as we walked in. 4 very shocked, very confused humans looked back at us. June and the doctor were stunned. They were looking at creatures that looked like us, but the size of children. Galactic confusion sprouted. 2 species living in space shouldn't look anything like each other, but here we were, nearly identical in all but size. Then the truth seeped out when our historians saw the humans and the logos that looked all too familiar. They were us, or rather, we were them. They were who we once were. The abductors had taken us from Earth before spaceflight had begun to take root. Their flags were the old emblems of freedom in our textbooks of prehistory. We had gained FTL whilst they fought their First World War. We had taken our position as the major power in the galaxy when they landed on the moon. Time and space changed our size and decompressed our skeleton, but we were practically the same. But Homo sapiens were different. They advanced at impossibly fast speeds after we gave them advanced FTL. A human alliance was made that reshaped the galaxy. Oddly enough, though, the issue over X-23A never got resolved. It is important to understand that the Great Confederation is not a benevolent organization. Neither is it particularly wicked. It is not built to be good, although it certainly strives to do so. It is not built to be bad, although many of its laws and policies have been twisted to perform acts of shocking cruelty. It is built primarily to endure, to stand as a bulwark against barbarism and anarchy, and as such it is astoundingly effective. In its endurance, the Confederation has acquired millennia of customs, rituals, and traditions that trail in the wake of its stately passage through the ages. Its bureaucrats spend thankless lifetimes wading through the morass. It could be argued that as superfluous as so many of these traditions seem, they serve to give the institution a certain inertia that holds it as steady as any treaties or threat of arms. It is one of our most ancient traditions that concerns us today, and its curious history with one of the Confederation's most recent members. When humanity finally breached the limits of its modest empire and became known to the galaxy's most esteemed institution, we told them our curious tradition. When a new race joins the ranks of the Great Confederation, it is customary to adopt an epithet suited to its particular qualities. Each name is a point of pride. It speaks to a race's history, not only that of its civilizations, but of its evolution itself, what gave it the strength to drag itself from the morass of base life up to the stars. The names are not complex and follow a basic scheme. The brachiating flow, whose spindly towers reach almost as high as their ambitions, became those who climb. The staunch Modelor, who grew from nomadic herds to traveling cities to armored drifter fleets, took the name those who wander in strength. The telepathic hive mind of the Richtikit, working in perfect synchronicity, adopted those who are one. It's a foolish tradition, as so many are. But just like so many others, there dwells in it a curious truth. A name is a promise, after all, and a warrior of those who die gloriously is likely to go down fighting for little more reason than to maintain the reputation of their species. More than anything, it displays the qualities a race is most proud of, or most aspires to. There are those who say it oversimplifies, or pigeonholes, or grandstands. But the tradition has held firm through thousands of cycles of peace and strife alike. So in spite of its antiquated roots, the topic of which name the humans would choose dominated Confederation discussion for sub-cycles on end. Not merely a rich vein of gossip, their choice would glean valuable insight for diplomacy, trade agreements, and the entertainment industry. Those who approach with caution are hardly going to be pulled in by gambling advertisements after all. The humans made their decision with an almost indecent haste. After only a handful of cycles, their representative took his place at the Confederation Senate to be formally inducted among our ranks. "Call us," they said, "those who run." It was a title that reignited gossip for cycles to come. Biologically, it made sense. The upright primates were certainly built for running. Not with any particular speed, but with a casual lope that seemed to serve their purposes. But there were 1,000 others they might have picked. What kind of a species names itself for cowardice? What kind of promise does that make? The following cycles only served to reinforce the opinion. The Terrans proved to be a race unusually averse to conflict. Where others would fight, they negotiated. Where others would seize, they gave ground. When pushed to a fight, placed between hammer and anvil, they always managed to squeeze out and find some kind of peaceful resolution. This manner gained them many friends, but few allies. Who could rely on a craven to support them in crisis when no peace could be found? When the time came to take a stand, who could trust in those who run? Perhaps it was the name that encouraged the Larashi in the end. No species enjoyed such a controversial place in the Confederation as the Larashi. Time and again they have sparked conflict and chaos for their own gain. Time and again they have proven their worth when the Confederation needs the proper application of brute force. Their evolution as apex pack predators is reflected in their lightning-fast attack fleets and cutthroat politicking. One way or another, the Larashi have well earned their epithet of those who scourge. It is perhaps unfair to judge every individual of a species by their race's reputation. Certainly there have been Larashi known for their kindness, their forgiveness, and hundreds of cycles with the Confederation might have distanced them from their most savage practices. But a name is a promise, after all. Historians across the galaxy can appreciate the difficulty in pinning down the root cause of any particular conflict. The Larashi were certainly looking to expand their holdings, and the virgin Terran territories were mightily tempting. But the Larashi royal family was also facing dissent within its aristocracy, and was in need of a common cause to unify the ranks. And of course, their economic power had diminished from a number of recent trade sanctions, and they ached for a chance to remind the Confederation of their military strength. But it could also be argued that the Larashi had simply done it to many fledgling races before, and were more than happy to do so again. Those of us sympathetic to the humans realized too late the careful web the Larashi had drawn them into over 100 minor disputes. Certainly the Terrans had no idea. They had been in the Confederation a scant handful of cycles. The Larashi had navigated its legal morass for centuries. They fitted humanity's noose with grace. If the Larashi had merely declared war on the Terrans, we might have blunted the blow. There are a number of Confederation bylaws and procedures in place for these kinds of things, ones that the victims of the Larashi have relied on in past conflicts. Amnesty, rules of engagement, foreign aid, and the like. But this was different. The ritual is known as Corral. It pits one Confederation member against another, with no aid or intervention from other members. In theory, it allows the resolution of disputes without setting off a powder keg of alliances and counter-alliances. In practice, it is used most often to cut a vulnerable race out from the herd. It is a savage tradition from the early cutthroat days of the Confederation. But as has been said before, age lends inertia to tradition, and it has proven frustratingly difficult to root out. To declare Corral requires highly specific conditions to be met, ones the Larashi had carefully engineered. Every conflict formed a piece of an elaborate picture, framing the Terrans as unjust aggressors and the Larashi as the victim on paper at least. And in an institution so woefully hidebound as the Confederation, paper was the most effective witness. When every piece had been placed, all that was left was the official declaration of war, which they proceeded to do with gusto and aplomb. On the floor of the Confederation Congress, under the eyes of 1,000 delegates, the Terran senator begged the Larashi to reconsider. They were a fledgling strength, he said. This war and all that happened next would define the future of both races. The Larashi senator laughed in his face. A laugh from those whose scourge unnerves everyone else in the room. Few predators manage to ascend to sentience, and the sight of their cruel, sharp teeth stirs primal fears long buried beneath the veneer of civilization. He drew forth an elaborate scroll, the official declaration of war, and cast it at the Terran's feet. He spoke the ancient challenge. "Karal," he said, "embrace us not. Our gifts are blades now, and cut at your hands. Call not to your allies. Their doors are closed to you. Sue not for terms, they shall be denied. Flee to your dens, gather your strength, and make your stand. We are coming." The Terrans had a modest fleet, capable of chasing off pirates on their trade routes. And of course, as soon as war had been declared, they began the long process of warship production. Factories not used since before humanity's unification cranked into life. But it would be long cycles before they could form defenses across their worlds. And the Larashi had long planned for this war. Indeed, their stockpiling of military assets was the subject of one of their many political conflicts with the humans. Until they could properly mobilize, the Larashi had their pick of the Terran territories. The only question was which planet they would hit first. The Cornico stars were a tempting choice. They lay closest to Larashi territory and would make a fine addition to their holdings. But they were virgin ground, underdeveloped. They could be claimed in time after they had broken the back of the Terran defenses. Earth itself was tempting as well. The loss of a race's homeworld would be a tremendous blow, one that has sent many an empire on a slow spiral to extinction. But humanity was well aware of its vulnerability and had prepared accordingly. More than a quarter of their forces were positioned to defend their home system. The Larashi could take it eventually, but the losses would be tremendous. They needed a symbol, something that would shatter humanity's resolve in a swift, singular strike. Something they did not defend properly. Something they took for granted so much that they could not imagine its loss. It might have taken years to find. But, as has been said, they had long planned for this war. Humanity's homeworld was still slowly healing from the eruption of their desperate climb to the stars. It would take hundreds of cycles to scrub the poison from its seas and skies. Now they were wiser. Their new worlds were developed with a careful eye on their ecosystems. But even among its harmonic compatriots, Avalon stood apart. Avalon was their chance to be better. The citizens of its cities were wardens of the planet, not its rulers. The trees stood tall, the animals roamed free, and the fields of tall grasses stretched from one horizon to the other. The planet stood as a symbol of everything the Terrans aspired to, or at least it did. Those whose scourge descended upon Avalon like wolves on the fold. For the first time, its residents looked up to see fire in the night sky as lasers seared through the meager defenses. The Terrans fought with courage, ferocity, and desperation. It didn't matter. Within hours, the Larashi had taken the planet. They might have abducted the native humans, shipped them off for chattel. They might have hung their banners from their city walls, taken their forts, looted their treasures. Those who scourge might have chased off those who run and ruled comfortably over their new holdings. But a name is a promise, after all. They took no captives on Avalon. They claimed no prizes, landed no colonists, plundered no resources. They glassed the cities with plasma bombardment and set the very atmosphere ablaze. The fields and forests burned, the seas boiled, and the animals within them died bewildered to their fate. Humanity's shining jewel was left a black, lifeless rock. The Larashi made an example of the world. It taught the Terrans a lesson. There was no act taboo under Karal. The only hope of humanity's survival lay in unconditional surrender. The counterattack was inevitable. The Larashi had cut humanity to the quick. There would be a single furious retaliation, lashing out at their hurt. But it would be the fury of a wounded beast. The next strike would be weaker, and the next weaker still. Those who scourge had evolved from deadly predators, worrying at the flanks of larger prey until they collapsed. This kind of war was second nature, so the human assault on the Larashi stronghold of Vakalat was hardly unexpected, nor was its ferocity. The scale of the attack, however, merited comment. The Terran military was a paltry thing, stretched thin to cover their merchant fleets. But now it was the Vakalat's turn to look up at the night sky as it filled with 1,000 new stars. No guardians of the merchant fleets these, but the fleet itself. Cargo haulers, mining ships, tuggers, now crudely mounted with whirling rotary cannons, single-shot railguns, and cheap missiles. The Larashi, proud warrior fetishists of the military elite, learned a human term that day: technicals. They also learned the effectiveness of weapons that are not weapons. Rivet guns, plasma cutters, and mining drills seem hardly practical for the purposes of warfare. But when a Larashi battlecruiser is swarmed by a half-dozen ships with empty magazines and fried railgun coils, charging at the larger prey to worry its flanks, the argument falters at about the same time as the fuel tanks. Vakalat was a fortified planet. Its forces were formidable, its captains seasoned, and within a single sub-cycle, it had fallen. To those it had scorned as warriors. To forces it had never even considered a threat. To those who run. This, in itself, was not extraordinarily worrying. Larashi military theory is aggressive to a fault. They put little faith in defense. They had lost ground, but they would soon make it up, and more besides. The Terran spirit had been broken. They would take the next planet with ease, except they didn't. They sent their fleet to Mead, the mercantile planet, to swallow the world in 1,000 mouths. But at Mead, they were glutted, choked, suffocated by 10,000, and now the Terrans had taken Rokoshok, the Larashi breadbasket. They tried a daring lightning strike at Porte, the Terran warp hubway station, to hobble their forces. But at Port, they were turned aside, and then the humans had claimed the shipping yards of Barakin, and the Larashi found themselves hobbled. They burned the technicals in droves, but now the humans were manufacturing true battleships, faster than anyone could have imagined, and they were terrors. The Larashi were masters of war. They had sneered at the crudely rigged merchant vessels, but now they could appreciate these new ships with an expert's eye. They traced the cruel, graceful lines of the prows. They admired the engines, envied the shields that shrugged off their fire, feared the searing lasers that tore their own apart. At every battlefield, the Larashi looked upon those ships and measured their own destruction to the erg. On the floor of the Confederation Congress, the Larashi senator called for a new motion. His bearing was still proud, his sneer unyielding. But there was a hesitance to him, an uncertainty that had not been there before. He called the Terran senator to the floor. This war had cost both factions, he said, and the Larashi had proven their point. The ritual of Corral would be called off. Those who Scourge would withdraw their fleets, the Terrans would return to their systems, and 1,000 Confederation subcommittees would swoop in to provide aid to the war-torn nations. It was a good deal. Those who run had proven themselves unexpectedly vicious in battle, and had expanded their holdings considerably from the conflict. Few fledgling races had managed to hold their own against those who Scourge, and none of them had actually claimed territory in the process. Already a number of nations offered their allyship to the small race, eager to recruit those deadly ships for their own purposes. But small they still were, a mere fraction of their aggressors, and no amount of tactical ingenuity or sheer righteous fury could close that gap. Those who run had stung the beast and turned it from its path. But they could not hope to maintain their success against Larashi, fighting to defend their heartlands. The deal they offered was the only real option. Under the eyes of 1,000 delegates, the Terran senator approached the Larashi. He drew a small scrap of fabric forth from his uniform. As he slowly unfolded the charred fragment, we realized what it was. Pulled from an expanse of blackened stone and glass stretching from one horizon to the other, all that was left of the flag of Avalon. He cast it at the Larashi senator's feet. "Corral," he said, "the blade cuts both ways. You began the ritual. You shall see it finished. Call not to your allies, their doors are closed to you now. Sue not for terms, they shall be denied. Flee to your dens, gather your strength, and make your stand. We are coming." The war continued. The Larashi tried every war trick they had learned in 1,000 lifetimes. They laid elaborate traps, picked away at Terran fleets, made glorious last stands. The ships of humanity, dreadful dreadnoughts as they were, could still be tricked, trapped, dragged down by numbers. Their burnt-out husks became a common sight among the Larashi territories, but it was never enough. The Terrans laid traps of their own, fought as well as those who Scourge. Every Terran ship the Larashi burned took a score with them. And more than that was their sheer, overwhelming relentlessness. No matter how many were killed, more came in an endless tide. In ravaging those who run, those who Scourge had stumbled across something completely unexpected. An equal in war, perhaps a superior. And that was the true tragedy to the Larashi. If they had nurtured the humans, joined forces, they might have taken on the Confederation itself. But in their pride, they had wounded a beast, and now felt the full measure of its claws. Slowly, quietly, we and the other nations withdrew our offers of allyship to the Terrans. We had mourned them as victims, rooted for them as underdogs. Now we feared them as monsters. Belatedly, we remembered what the Terran ambassador had said. This war and all that happened next would define the future of both races. We remembered how desperately he had pled for peace. Only now did we realize what exactly he had tried to hold back. The war continued. The Terrans cut a hole into the Larashi territories and poured into the wound in droves. Those who Scourge could not stop them, any more than they could stop the moons in their orbits. Humanity did not scourge the planets they captured. They merely burned their shipyards and launching zones, crippled their ability to mobilize, and moved on. As they blazed a line across the planets, their aim became clear. Nothing less than the Larashi homeworld itself, Catonant. The story of its fall threatens to become repetitive, an echo of every battle before it, differing only in its tremendous scale. The Larashi fought with courage, ferocity, and desperation. It was not enough. On and on they came, until Catonant's low orbit filled with charred metal and flesh. When the dawn rose on the Larashi's ancient homeworld, the sun shone haphazardly, filtered through the thick haze of war debris. And it dawned on a Terran flag. The war continued. Catonant was theirs. They had cut the Larashi to the quick. There was a furious counterattack, of course, but it was the fury of a wounded beast. The next strike was weaker, and the one after that. They were bleeding out now, on a slow spiral to extinction. But the Terrans were not content to wait. They had taken the homeworld, true, but they did not hold a planet responsible for the genocide of Avalon. Nor did they blame the entirety of the Larashi race for the war crime. No, they knew where to lay that blame. The Larashi royal family, whose word has been law for time immemorial. It was on their orders that Avalon burned. Bringing them to justice, however, proved difficult. Before the first Terran ship appeared in Catonant's skies, the royal family had quietly slipped away to a neighboring system. Their absence was not lost on the planet's defenders. Indeed, it was a not inconsiderable factor in their defeat. Still, humanity had been denied their true goal, so they took that system too. Once more the nobility fled, and once more the Terrans followed. When that system had been taken in turn, the royal family split for better chances. Some disguised themselves and hid amongst the Larashi populace. Some paid enormous bribes to other nations to take them in violation of the ancient ritual. Some sought refuge with the pirates in the outer fringes, who paid no lip service to Corral. Still, humanity did not relent. Where brute force did not suffice, they turned to cunning. Their agents infiltrated their havens and tracked down each offending member with an ability that bordered on the uncanny. Those hiding amongst their own were extracted. The nations sheltering them were confronted, threatened with exposure unless they were surrendered. Still, brute force had a use. At the fringes of known space, the Terrans ravaged the outlaw fleets with a cruelty that those who Scourge could respect. They had started the war fighting pirates. Now, in its waning days, they found themselves fighting them once more. But now they wielded an intent and fury the outlaws had never seen. Their every hidden holdout was rooted out and burned. It wasn't long before they gave up the nobles to stem the bloodshed. And even still, the war continued. The last free member of the Larashi royal family, the son of the ruling king, fled to the last holdout he had. The planet Ublo, whose unique ionic atmosphere shorted out any technology more advanced than a sharpened stick. His ship fried to a dead hulk, his tools destroyed, he landed on Ublo's surface with nothing but a parachute and his skin. A one-way trip in every sense. But that was all right. He was of those who Scourge, evolved to take its place at the top of the food chain. Ublo was a world dominated by dry, wind-scoured plains, but game could be found if one knew where to look. He could survive here, a banished prince, and keep a shred of his pride. The Terrans would not dare chase him to Hublot. Any who came after him would not be returning. They would have to content themselves with leaving him in exile. He held that certainty close to him. It warmed him on cold nights, gave him comfort in isolation. It kept him going for almost a full cycle, right up until he saw the Terran ship descending and felt it wither in his chest. The ship crashed, as they always did. But like the prince, its pilot landed safely, a single human female, bringing nothing more than her flight suit and a single knife. She looked at the wreckage of her ship, her only hope of a journey home. Then she turned toward the endless plains, and she began to run. There are stories told of the long chase between those who scourge and those who run. Were we in a more romantic age, it would have been the stuff of myths. As it were, it was relegated merely to historical archives and melodrama. It went on for cycles. A planet is an unfathomably large span to travel on foot, and even though the Terran had landed as close to the Larashi's ship as she could, that reduced it to merely a fraction of unfathomable. She had no devices with which to trace the prince, no vehicle, no medicine. But then again, neither did he. The Larashi are ambush predators, built for quick bursts of speed. They explode out at their prey, all claws and teeth, for that one short chase that determines life or death. A slow Larashi can outpace a fast human on their worst day. But humans are not built for bursts of speed. They are built for endurance, a fact the prince slowly became aware of over his endless flight. The Terran ran slowly, but she simply didn't stop. The Larashi ran as far as his aching legs could take him, but every time he stopped to rest, the distance between them closed. He simply could not escape her. Neither could he evade her. He used the ancient tricks of the wild, crossing streams, avoiding soft ground, doubling back. He laid traps for the human with as much ingenuity as he could conjure. But none of it worked. She could trace him by the bending of twigs, a scent on the wind. She saw through his traps as though she had laid them herself. The Terrans had chosen their hunter with care. The Larashi prince, apex predator that he was, soon learned a human term: persistence hunting. Perhaps if he had faced her directly, he might have defeated her. At the end of things, he was still a killer by nature, and she with no more weapons than a knife. But his courage was gone, his pride broken, his homeland taken, his nation conquered. He could not hope to defeat her any more than his species could have defeated hers. In the end, all he could do was run, and she was much better at that. The Terran occupied every waking moment of his thoughts. He could not even escape her in his dreams. Closer and closer she came, until he ran himself ragged, until he crawled desperately through the desert, until he finally collapsed. When she finally arrived and put the knife to his throat, he was almost grateful. 10 years to the day, the Terran ship had crashed on Hublot's shores. A hole opened up in the planet's protective ionosphere. Not for long, barely time enough for a small craft to descend to the surface and return. But even as it touched down, 2 figures could be seen: a human and her Larashi captive arriving at the predetermined landing site. The technology to defy Hublot's particular prisonous atmosphere is not beyond imagination. It could be achieved by a vast team of scientists with the proper motivation. But it is an extraordinary expenditure of time and resources to capture a single individual. It seemed a fitting capstone for humanity's most revealing conflict, the lengths to which they would go to avenge their injustices. And, at last, the war ended. We watched in dread fascination as the humans determined the fate of the Larashi. The race was entirely at their mercy. They might claim their entire territory as a prize of war, or make vassals of them. Then again, enslaving the entire population was not out of the question, nor was a complete extermination. No act was taboo under Karal, and the Terrans had proved themselves a merciless species. But the humans did none of these. They imprisoned the royal family on charges of war crimes. They were shipped to the ruins of Avalon. Already the humans had begun the arduous process of recultivating life on the ruined planet. Already the first basic phages had begun to grow amid the glass and ash. It would take more than 1,000 cycles before the planet regained its former glory. But the Larashi royals would work its earth their entire lives to quicken the process. The remaining nobility, those with too tenuous a connection to claim complicity for Avalon, were gathered at Catonant. The Larashi, whose royal dynasty stretched back unbroken through its entire recorded history, learned a human term that day: balkanization. Their mighty kingdom was splintered into a dozen minor nations, whose petty feuds and infighting would undermine any attempt at a unified front. And like that, those whose scourge would pose no more threat to any race. Perhaps someday a strong enough personality might unite the kingdoms once more. But it would be many cycles in the future, and they would think hard before attacking the humans again. On the floor of the Confederation, the Terran senator submitted a motion long in the making. The war had gone on long enough, he said, and they had proven their point. Corral would be ended. Aid could be given. The 12 new Larashi sub-delegates raised no objections. In the hours afterwards, I had an opportunity to meet with the Terran ambassador over refreshments. Had his species barely won the conflict, he might have been swarmed with admirers and sycophants. But their overwhelming onslaught had earned more fear than respect, and so he sat alone. I summoned courage and approached him. He, in turn, welcomed the company. "You're braver than most," he said. "Before, we were weak and I had many friends, but now we are strong, and I foresee a lonely future." "Can you blame us?" I said. "We never could have imagined what you were capable of." "We haven't had to be warriors for a very long time," he said. "But we never forgot how. A name is a promise, after all." "Those who run?" He laughed. "Not quite," he said. "That was a mistranslation from a malfunctioning device. By the time we realized the error, it seemed too trivial to correct." "A mistranslation?" He smiled, and for the first time I noticed the sharp teeth at the corners of his mouth. "It's not those who run," he said. "It's those who chase." Last visual recording of First Admiral Afferntal. The footage kicked in and the dark room was lit up in a flickering artificial light. On the screen was a Lars, a red face creature that had similarly red protrusions coming out from the edges of her head like spines. Her eyes were completely red, but in a lighter shade, and she looked terrified by the way her spine-like protrusions wobbled, and in the way her hairless brow was raised. Her voice was shaken when she spoke. "We were once a happy galaxy. We had shed our warlike tendencies in favor of peace and prosperity. Indeed, the Total Disarmament Act had outlawed anything that sole purpose was to damage or kill. We explored the far reaches of our galaxy, found other interplanetary communities and some still to venture towards the stars, and taught them our pacifist ways. That is why, when we reached System 26-8B, now remanded the Sol system, we were appalled at what we had discovered. Humans, the most self-destructive creatures of all time. We knew that they would be a hard species to convert to pacifism before we even saw them, as we noticed their planet was a death world. We had just converted a death world to pacifist ways, and we thought we could do that same here. But then a war broke out. The humans call it the Second World War. We call it the Abomination. We immediately broke off all attempts to contact them. They were far beyond our help, far too suspicious and paranoid. A few decades after the war, we ventured back to Earth, even whilst the rest of the galaxy pleaded with us to not let the monsters out. But then we saw they had evolved into new barbarism. A proxy war had broken out. They spied on each other, friend or foe for intelligence, betrayed and backstabbed each other as they threatened nuclear annihilation. We decided to leave them after we sampled their culture, if you could call it that, and saw their reaction to aliens, and saw their reaction was shoot and kill. There were many reactions to this. Even though we had created a paradise of pacifism, some of us were keener to blow them up, destroy them in the exact way their moving pictures depicted. We rejected this. In their outermost asteroid field, we set up impenetrable force fields. They couldn't leave. No one could get in. We let asteroids leave and their probes too, so that they didn't suspect anything. Our hope was they would kill themselves and we wouldn't have to worry. Actually, using the force field was the worst-case scenario. But they didn't die. About 95 years after the Abomination, they started to set up permanent colonies on the 4th planet, and within a century they were on the moons of the 5th and 6th planets. The First Admiral coughed up a bit of orange blood, which trickled down her front. She wiped it off her chin and began talking again. We realized that they had nearly discovered FTL. They had advanced at unbelievable rates, far faster than any others before them. Their brains, it seemed, worked faster than the average sentient. This, in turn, lowered their life expectancy, and their sleep times were amazingly long as the planet went for an intelligence over strength evolution. Their first working FTL ship hit our force field and exploded. We all shrank back at this. They had launched a ship to the stars asking what was out there, and the stars yelled back no. The humans didn't do much else. They just stopped. Or so it seemed. For the first time in 1,000 years, we began military preparation, the entire galaxy. I was among those who joined. We hoped to talk them down with overwhelming size. But that wasn't how it happened. We were sat outside the force field, waiting when more probes, more than ever before, were sent out. We let them out. We had no reason to not, and waited even longer. Psychological warfare, they called it. They had a name for war to make your opponent mentally exhausted. Then their fleet came. Impossible numbers at impossible sizes. They had expanded so fast it was impossible to see how back then. Later, we found out they always knew we were there. Their probes scanned us. The tech was so backwards we didn't even see it coming, and they built their ships from what they saw of us. They shot at the force field with a volley, unlike anything we had seen before. Then the force field broke, overloaded by firepower. I am ashamed of what we did next. We started to shoot at them. Were we frightened? Definitely. But the humans didn't fire at us when the force field dropped. She coughed up the orange blood again, and the video started to fail. The ceiling spat sparks at the floor and over her body. The war, the horrible war, began afterwards. The humans won the battle we began, and the pushed. We tried to communicate our surrender, but they spoke differently than we did. We could understand their writing, but they couldn't comprehend ours as we talked through releasing gases. They made the air dance for them. So the war went on. Battle after battle, they won, we lost. We had 1,000 years of peace, and they had 2,000 years of war. They could fight. We could not. My ship was destroyed after the battle for the homeworld. They've glassed our planet. All the people there are dead like so many other worlds. A silent tear streamed down her eye. She was choking now, gasping for air. The sparks remorselessly spat down on her as if disgusted, and she died. Not long after the recording itself failed, it was sent out alongside the emergency transmission. On the other side of the galaxy, they watched horrified. Already they were removing logos and flags of association, so when the humans came, they would stop and see they had met the border. But now they knew the humans wouldn't stop, and they couldn't stop them. Entry 1. The delegation will meet for the first time today. I'm keeping this record as ordered, though I don't see the point. The humans aren't exactly reclusive, but the hoops they made themselves jump through before they even returned our first contact message were absurd. I heard secondhand that they nearly went into a civil war over the possibility of our message being bait for some sort of trap. Are they just naturally paranoid, or have they run into some other species of non-humans that gave them trouble? I rather suspect the former. Their military, for just having one star system, is pretty numerous. Entry 2. The humans sent up some civilian diplomat instead of a military leader. I was surprised. They seem to value martial prowess fairly highly, so why do they have a civilian leader? Apparently, this guy was selected after a brief voting period, which wasn't made open to the general population, but was only open to national leaders. That's troubling. National leaders in a spacefaring species? That can only mean delays in the future. Entry 3. A few more diplomats came up today with huge stacks of portable computers. Our translators already added the one language they have used so far to the universal system, so we didn't have any trouble deciphering the data from the computers. Apparently, they want to know as much as possible about us, and in exchange, they provided a bunch of information about themselves, their history, some more language dialects we didn't have covered yet, and some of their own star maps. I was stunned. Why are they being so trusting? They were on the verge of a civil war when we contacted them. No, it was because we contacted them. Entry 4. I know it's been several weeks since I last updated this thing, but the humans' data is taking up all of my time. Apparently, they have been in a state of what we would consider constant civil war since their people evolved far enough to grasp fire. Over the dumbest things, too, from religion to territory. Nearly a fifth of all of their most important technology, including their relativistic drive technology, was derived from something designed to kill other humans. No wonder they're being so open. Our people wouldn't engage in an internal war on the scale these humans have, ever. They've killed more of themselves in the last 1,000 years than my people have ever died. Total. Entry 5. The 9th week of the contact meeting is ending now. The reactions from the humans on their worlds have been more interesting than all the data they gave us by now. They're starting to get back to routine. They have their own planet, another planet, and about 5 moons in their system colonized to some degree, and each has a distinct culture and way of life. The reaction on each when we made contact was the same. They flipped out and their peoples were seized by everything ranging from panic to joy. But now, their reactions have stabilized to the extent that I don't think we're going to get a reaction out of them unless we create some further provocation. The most read news articles on their electronic communication networks are more about domestic problems and entertainment and their economies than they are about us. Are humans just more comfortable in routines, or are they frustrated with our lack of diplomatic progress? I'm confused. The humans I've met seem unconcerned, but I know the ambassador from our people is getting worried. Entry 6. I'm relieved. The human ambassador met me personally today, informally, here on the ship. He said that he could tell that I was getting worried about the negotiations, and he wanted to address me personally. I asked how he could tell I was worried when he had only met our species for the first time less than 100 solar cycles ago, and he replied that it was all part of being a diplomat. I stated outright that I was confused by the seeming lack of disruption on the part of the people below. He said that there were plenty of people who were disrupted, but that most of the humans in the system had already decided to wait and see what the outcome of the negotiations were before doing anything. After all, he said, even if my species becomes an active member of the galactic community, most humans will stay right here, living their lives. We'll be affected by galactic politics, new technology, and colonization, even assuming that we could find new Earth-type worlds out there, but most will want to stay right where they are. I asked him how he could say that when so many of his people had colonized the rest of the system, and he laughed. I think. It's completely different when you can see Earth out your window. Entry 7. Things have picked up so much. We got our translators working to the effect that nuance of speech, not just content, can be translated appropriately. The human ambassador's speech and conversation were suddenly so much clearer. To his credit, he told us that he had been refraining from common speech, slang, and aphorism as much as possible. I wouldn't want to use a saying or phrase that had a clear meaning to another human, but made no sense, or worse, insulted one of your people. Now I can speak freely. I have to wonder if this faster-paced dialogue will negatively affect the negotiations. The ambassador broached the toughest topic today. Faster than light travel. Entry 8. Generally, species are content to create FTL on their own before they even contact us, or vice versa. Humans are the exception. They colonized their entire star system with 7 inhabited bodies and over 1,000 mined, explored, probed, or mapped bodies with no habitation in their system. So much of their population lives in their orbital platforms that their own homeworld barely even supports 2/3 of their species. They did this without FTL. Clearly, the fact that they have reacted peacefully to our presence rather than precipitously fighting or ignoring us indicates that they are mature enough to handle faster-than-light travel. But I am privately concerned. One of the human diplomats has already begun copying our speech and movement patterns. I found myself opening up to him without even realizing it until afterwards. He must be doing it on purpose to set us at ease. After 120 of their days, they're copying the behavior of their first alien contact. This is one of their finest diplomatic minds, of course, but still, if they can do it with behavior, can they do it with technology? I suspect they will ask for a working FTL drive to study in their next meeting. Entry 9. I am vindicated, it seems. I spoke my concerns to the ambassador today, and he agreed that there would be no gifting of FTL technology to the humans, that they would have to earn it on their own. The humans would react poorly, I guessed, but tactfully, as at least a few of them seem to genuinely care what we think. I was right, naturally. The human ambassador asked that their people be given a working FTL drive to reverse engineer in exchange for an unspecified piece of technology of theirs. Their technology, the ambassador quickly replied, was inferior to ours in every way save communications, and we had no need for their communications technology. Communicating faster than light is something we can do already. Communicating instantaneously anywhere in their system, as they do, is a wondrous piece of technology, but not necessary for our people. The human ambassador reacted with shock and surprise immediately, and then quickly became suspicious. I think he may have gleaned that we have discussed this amongst ourselves. How? I cannot guess. We spoke of other things, and the ambassador of the humans seemed mollified by the discussions that followed. Will he broach it again? Probably. Entry 10. The humans surprise us. It is exactly half of 1 year after first contact, and life, as I before noted, continues. They are fully 1/3 finished with another of their orbital habitation platforms, and we were given a tour of the construction site. Huge robotic construction devices smelt down chunks of ore from the many asteroid and lunar mining platforms the humans have throughout their system, ferried to them by relativistic drive-powered ore haulers. The slag is then fed into their forges and reduced to elemental purity, and the refined ore is then crafted, still in space, into modules, which are then attached to the frame of the space installation. The elemental slag is mostly hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and silicon in this system. They use these things to make air and computers, apparently, which are then used in the construction of their platforms. I am astounded. They have created the most efficient industrial complex we have ever seen, by necessity. They lack FTL, so in the absence of easily reachable resource deposits that they can mine on their colonies, they simply process asteroids into something useful. Another reason to deprive them of FTL? If they can prosper in such paucity, how will they react to plenty? Entry 11, disaster. One of the probes that the humans use to drag the ores they extract from their asteroid belts slammed into our ship today. Our force fields held, but the drone was wrecked beyond repair, and the asteroid deflected towards Earth. It now moves only a few times faster than the speed of sound, leisurely by space travel standards, but it is colossal. It will depopulate the part of the planet it hits, surely. I am told that the probes and ore haulers use a computer guidance system to slip into Earth orbital slots with their payloads, where the ores are removed by the pace and need that the human construction schedule dictates. If we had not been in the path of these probes, this would have never happened. The humans provided us with a copy of the ore haulers' schedules to avoid just such a calamity. How did this happen? What will happen to Earth? Entry 12. We have come to a conclusion. The crew and diplomatic staff have decided that we will divert the asteroid into the Earth's sun, using our own ship to provide the stopping mechanism. Our fields are not recharged. The impact will kill us. We are not committing lightly, fully. Half the crew said that we should abandon the humans to their fate and continue on negotiating. Some of the rest said that we should do all that we can without destroying ourselves. But I and the ambassador disagree. We did this. Our misgivings about their technological level aside, the humans should not be driven to near extinction by their own first contact. Entry 12. Addendum. Bizarrely enough, all is well. The asteroid nearly hit the planet when the humans took matters into their own hands. We had maneuvered our ship into the path of the asteroid, ready to deflect the massive thing with our own ship, if need be. We did this. This was our fault. Except the human diplomats were frantic, demanding that we move the ship at once. We were baffled. We were offering to solve the problem we had caused, so why were the humans demanding that we did not? They beseeched us to move, to let the asteroid move along its own path, directly towards the planet, saying that we did not deserve to suffer, to bear the brunt of this calamity. Finally, we gave in and moved out of the course of the asteroid. We were watching what we thought would be the end of the Earth below. But we were wrong. A blast appeared near the asteroid, and we realized what was happening. The humans had detonated a nuclear device in the asteroid's path to divert it. Not destroy it, no, but divert it. A few dozen of their own drone craft slammed into the side of the asteroid which had just been hit by the bomb, propelling it into near-Earth orbit. The human ambassador actually took me aside and explained that they had a contingency set aside for just such a catastrophe, dating back to when they had first created the mining drone and ore hauler network. He told me that the technology they had first employed to create the interplanetary ore haulers had originally been far more primitive and unable to precisely calculate the appropriate course and speed to get the asteroid safely back to Earth. The asteroid diversion weapons and drones had been created to reduce any risk. In total shock, I asked why they had done this, and almost as importantly, why they had been willing to risk such a mining venture if they knew such a potential problem existed. "Necessity is the mother of invention," he replied. Entry 13. 50 days have passed since the asteroid incident, and the humans' reaction has been alarming. Civilian populations, and not a few military, across the system are clamoring for attention, some demanding that the human diplomats apologize for what they have done, as if the humans caused this. Others demanding that we suffer for this transgression, others yet launching into wild speculation. Above it all, the human ambassador has changed the tack of these negotiations completely. Now all he seems to ask about is the justice systems of the galaxy, where before he has inquired about everything from laws restricting invasive plant species in agriculture to FTL drives to the origins of our linguistic colloquialisms. When asked what his official stance about the asteroid incident will be by other members of his own species who are not part of his delegation, he replies cryptically, "Patience is a virtue. Never close doors you cannot open. Invite no conflict where none exists. Yellow is most flavorful." I have no idea what the last one means. Perhaps our translators are not as capable of translating euphemisms as we thought. Regarding the possession of the nuclear devices they employed to divert the asteroid, he has hastened, quite uninvited, to assure us that it has been over a century and a half since any nuclear device was used in war. This assuages my fears somewhat, especially since we discreetly scanned the complex on the planet's surface that launched the nuke, and found that even the most powerful of these devices is little more than 6 times the effective power of the ones they employed. Strong enough to damage our fields, surely, but nowhere near enough to destroy us outright. But I should not be thinking of these potential new friends as potential new enemies, as he himself says. Entry 14. Again, I'm amazed by the human's ability to ignore trouble. It is now 250 days after first contact, and the human media has actually greatly reduced their mention of us and the asteroid incident. They are now beginning to return to what I am told, with vast disgust interestingly, by the human ambassador is the norm for their media, music, banal daily news, and what I think may be some form of medical treatment aimed at those who suffer reproductive isolation. The fact that, in less than a year, the human species has been exposed to alien life and nearly been wiped out by the carelessness of said life seems to have been absorbed by the population with a genuinely amazing degree of blasé acceptance. I understand we will be going on a tour of Earth itself tomorrow, though in full bodysuits, naturally. We will have to be. Their atmosphere is breathable, of course, but their sun is so much more radioactive than ours in the spectra of ultraviolet and radio that to not wear suits would be downright stupid. Our own ambassador told me that he thought it was to prevent any sort of insult, but I was not sure. Some of the human ambassadors seemed outright angry at our presence, and several were apparently restrained from outburst only by their peers' angry gestures. I think it has something to do with the nearly groveling request the human chief ambassador gave to us on the very first day, not to even decrypt, let alone translate, a single one of the millions of messages sent to our ship, directly or otherwise, that did not bear his signature. Entry 19. 300 solar days have passed since the humans replied to our communications. We hold meetings on their planet as often as we do in space now. I am pleased by this, in all honesty. There is a strange appeal to these people that was simply not there when we first met. One particularly unguarded conversation with a human diplomatic aide produced an interesting result. The young woman said that she and many others were raised on fiction involving humanity playing the defender against unexplained or meaningless alien invasion, or playing the victim of some horrible, incomprehensible force of destruction, and the thought that life beyond their own system would be friendly and share the virtue of self-sacrifice was a vast relief. I had never considered this. Most species in this galaxy we find are very open with us immediately, or at least after a very brief period of distrust. These people did not trust us beyond discussion until we had offered our lives to save their planet. Yet it seemed that we had achieved more in that act of proposed sacrifice than we had realized. These humans do, however, place too much emphasis on propriety for the sake of propriety. I do hope this woman does not come to reprimand because of our entirely unofficial exchange. The ambassador of the humans has certainly been making more and more of an effort to control what we see and hear of these people the more time we spend with them. Entry 20. I understand fully now why the human ambassador was trying to restrict our communications. The ship's crew, not a part of our diplomatic efforts, have been covertly compiling and translating vast amounts of the messages directed to our ship without our approval. We have been exposed to their indirect communications, of course. We discovered them through the presence of their first radio transmissions, after all, and we have tapped their system-wide information networks, but the unauthorized communications directed to us specifically have been politely ignored and untranslated, thanks almost entirely to the human ambassador's fervent pleas. The crew of the ship, however, have found that some of these signals contain messages of such hate and vitriol, such murderous rage and terrorized accusations, that had I not spent over 300 local days immersing myself in their culture, I could have mistaken it for a declaration of war. The human ambassador has much to answer for. Entry 21. The human ambassador was confronted over the messages we have received today. I asked him to meet us aboard the ship, not our own ambassador, such as to put him at ease. He met us without his various aides and diplomats, with nobody but him, his second, the ambassador, the ship's captain, and me present. We tried a tactic that I suggested myself, placing transcripts of the communications before him with no comment. He picked them up, curious, and riffed through them, displaying a chemical reaction that drained much of the blood from his face. His second could stand to look at the communiques no more than he. He looked through a few pages before seemingly getting the gist, dropping them on the table and looking at us blankly. Our ambassador asked him what he had to say on behalf of the people who sent the messages, and he replied only after a few seconds of staring at the table. I wish they did not exist. Imagine the room, the three of us, sitting across from two human diplomats who looked so nervous they could have been taken for gravely ill. Not one of us even saying a word. I do not know how long we sat like that. Finally, the ambassador asked the obvious, just to ensure no meaning was lost. The people, or the messages? The people, the ambassador replied sadly. People so afraid of what they're unfamiliar with that they hate it. It's an instinct we should have shed by now. Entry 22. The human ambassador seemed disarmed, even resigned. Why should he not be? He had been caught in a lie of omission. The ship's captain spoke next. Some of these people are threatening violence against the diplomats under my protection. Why should I permit that? The human ambassador's second looked rather sullen at the word permit, but did nothing. The human ambassador acted as if he had not heard. Humans are a tribal people by nature, and we did not evolve as the pinnacle predator. So we treat cultures we have not experienced and potential threats we have not faced before with great skepticism. Why do you think we suddenly allowed you to visit Earth after the incident with the asteroid? You showed a virtue we share, willingness to sacrifice. It's easier to relate to someone who acts like you. Then why did the hateful messages not cease entirely? I asked. The human ambassador shook his head. Because, sir, the human race is a fractious one. We do not think with one mind or share one opinion. Why do you think we still have the United Nations around? The more humans there are in a room, the more inevitable the disagreements are. He actually smiled. It's about the only thing that makes normal human diplomacy bearable. The educated mind likes nothing more than a disagreement. But these messages are not invitations to a debate, I pressed. Some are open messages of hate. And many humans are stupid, the human ambassador replied with disgust. Products of intolerant upbringing or ideology. Suppress them then, the captain said with equal disgust. Never, the human ambassador said with sudden vigor. All humans of any importance agree on this. Everybody has a right to be wrong. Anyway, he said with somewhat less passion, nothing is more attractive to the dispossessed than an officially sanctioned bad idea. Entry 23. 11 lunar cycles, just over 300 local days, have passed since I arrived. The humans have given up pressing for FTL drive technology completely now, seeing that it will get them nowhere. We have addressed the humans directly, without a buffer of diplomats at the UN headquarters, or through proxies like the ambassador. We spoke on their interplanetary data network, using their admittedly superior instantaneous broadcaster. The human ambassador has recovered quickly from the shock we gave him, much to his credit. It was, in fact, he who suggested that we address the people directly. He told us people would react best if we broke down our speech to the simplest possible elements, explaining why we made each decision. I thought that that would be interpreted as an insult, but he assured me that if there was one thing that humans resented in unison, it was having people talk as if everybody in the audience understood exactly what was going on. So we told them what the ambassador had told them already, that we were representatives of a large confederacy of species who agreed to mutual defense in the case of extragalactic invasion, constantly invoked, refusal of FTL drive technology to those who did not already have it, blessedly a rare concern, and integrating new species into the galactic community. Humanity was one of less than a dozen. The people of Earth were then permitted to ask questions of us directly, screened by a human diplomatic team on Earth and sent up to us. They ranged from the banal, what's your homeworld called in English, to the probing, from what stems your desire to keep us from FTL, to the disturbing, do your people ever invade others? I wonder what use it could do, but the human ambassador seemed to think it was a success. Entry 24. Only a few days left in our Earth diplomatic exchange. The ambassador of the humans seems to have taken ill somehow. He has been more and more uncomfortable in his dealings with us, in the physical sense. At the advice of his cohort, we have taken to keeping all of our meetings on Earth, so that he does not have to abide by the discomforts of the quick but rough transit from the surface to the ship. Here he seems more familiar, if not more comfortable. He has explained to me the reason for his sudden change of topic all those days ago, after the asteroid incident. He said that he had wanted to know how our people treated its criminals, not in punishment for their crimes, but in our leniency to the excused. If someone commits a crime, for instance, but saves another's life, do we let him go, or punish him fully, or punish him less? We told him then that generally it depended on the severity of the crime, for some crimes cannot be uncommitted. He explained that he had relaxed upon hearing that because it was a value we shared, though not all of the nearly 200 nations on Earth, let alone the 6 colonies, had justice in common. Entry 25. The ambassador worsens now, his health deteriorating. Our meetings last only a few hours, with the rest of our time spent poring over the larger and larger amounts of information his staff have been releasing to us. Information about their militaries, mostly, knowledge regarding their capability to adapt to warfare in space. Our talk of extragalactic threats, it seems, has startled several of the species' military leaders, and they wanted to know how much they would have to change if they agreed to be part of our confederation. We took one look at their military history and realized that they would have to retool their entire military from the ground up. Over 9/10 of the armed forces they had available to them were tied to the ground, with most, if the remainder, comprising obsolete oceanic navies and aerospace forces that couldn't seriously threaten our escape pods, much less our juggernaut-tier defender ships. One thing that was actually somewhat surprising to me was the data regarding their nuclear weapons. One file stated that at one point, one of the now dissolved nations of their people had possessed a nuclear weapon called Bomb of Kings that could have produced a yield over 200 times that of the bomb that diverted that asteroid. A blast like that could have reduced our diplomatic cruiser to a fine radioactive powder. Yet, it seemed that all such weapons were decommissioned and turned into power plant fuel decades before our first contact. What was surprising to me was that these very warlike people could have displayed the restraint needed to make weapons such as that and not use them. There were well in excess of 24,000 nuclear weapons in humanity's history, detailed in 2 global arms races in 2 centuries. Yet only 2 had been used. Entry 26. 360 days have passed. The human ambassador is dying. Neither their own medical technology nor ours, even if offered, could save him. He is suffering from a massive, systematic organ failure that his staff has privately informed me to be symptomatic of heavy metal poisoning. I am in shock. How? Why? We have done no such thing to him. The hate-filled messages aimed at us from the surface have not changed in volume or content either. So who has done this? Entry 27. The human ambassador has contacted me privately from his deathbed. Not the ambassador, not the captain, me. He has told me privately that he knew he had been poisoned when he had taken us on one of our tours of the United Nations, when someone had slipped a poison in his drink. He hadn't figured it out until his doctors had told him roughly what day it had occurred, and had no idea who, specifically, was responsible. He told me to contact the ambassador and captain on his behalf and tell them, and instruct them to tell nobody else. I asked him why I was to keep it secret, and he told me that he wanted us to make a decision. He then broke the connection before I could ask him what he meant. Needless to say, I am apprehensive. The man knows he's been poisoned in the final days of the negotiations, so keeping it quiet when the culprit is unknown I can understand. But why would he distrust the rest of our crew and diplomats? Had he suspected us, he would never have told us. Entry 28. The human ambassador is perhaps the boldest being I have ever encountered in all my centuries of life. Surely he cannot have planned for every single outcome of this venture. Surely he cannot have predicted what we would do. Not now, after less than a year of knowing of our existence, after 40 days of crippling illness. Surely he could not. And yet here we are. Now on the final day of the conference, he announced, "Live to the whole species," that he had less than a day to live, and that he knew that one of the diplomats on his trusted staff had poisoned him in the UN. He then cut the three of us into the transmission, streaming from the bridge of our ship. I can only thank goodness that we have been in front of live humans beyond the diplomatic corps so infrequently, else they would have seen our shock and horror at the sudden recording. The human ambassador then went on to state that he had told the aliens, had told us, that he knew that we were innocent, and that it was time for us to make a decision. Entry 29. He said that if humanity was to become a trusted and valuable member of the galactic community, capable of upholding the responsibility of the Confederacy's laws and mutual defenses, that we had to do the same. We had, he said, the means of depopulating Earth right before us. The asteroid we had accidentally diverted towards Earth. He smirked through the drugs and pain, and said that trust was a two-way street. We needed to be able to trust humanity, but humanity needed to trust us. And so, I leave it to you, my faraway friends, he managed, to render unto us the just deserts of this betrayal. I trusted. You can inflict the punishment of the arbitrary, dropping an asteroid on our entire population, almost certainly killing the one responsible, and demonstrating what humanity has in excess, or you could not, and demonstrate what I think I see in you. He cut his channel. Entry 30. There we sat, three aliens before the entire human species. I couldn't see them, but I could see their world. An entire planet, 10 billion people, with three aliens controlling them all. Every single one of our communications channels, from radio to data stream to the instant cast relay we were using to broadcast, was active, with unheard hails from across the solar system. Three aliens and a year of diplomacy to decide the fate of a species. The ambassador broke our frozen state of shock. Choosing his words carefully, he spoke to the instant cast. We have just seen the closest thing to a human leader killed by one of his own aides. This reflects rather poorly on your species' ability to think ahead. You have had two periods in your history when you collected nuclear weapons, in case you might have had to use them. Half of your people live in untenable squalor, the other half travel the planets. He leaned forward, obviously dreading his next words. I have read your history, steeped in blood. Your own ambassador admitted in shame that tens of thousands of communications, with which we have been bombarded since we arrived, represent a substantial portion of your population and their mindset. Ignorant, fearful, theocratic. You actually have the nerve to make war on yourselves, even as you petition for the ability to spread to other star systems and join our defense against the enemy from beyond the galaxy." He sat back, looking drained. "Now, your ambassador, without even so much as warning us, forces to decide whether or not your people get to exist or join the Confederacy even if you do. It is not, to borrow a phrase, what I signed up for." Entry 31. Then he turned to me, and his thoughts must have echoed my own, and the captain's. He looked back at the camera and grinned. "Yet, the very person who just entrusted you to us clearly thought that you were worthy of us. He has spoken at length about the virtues we share: compassion for the family, sacrifice when needed, curiosity. He said that nothing we had done or said or shared could have achieved as much as our willingness to divert that asteroid did. He showed us the monuments to progress your people have made. Your people achieved powered flight less than 300 years ago, yet you have colonized 6 bodies in your system, 2 terraformed from little more than rock and methane ice. You show a drive and an adaptability we have never seen before. After less than a year of meetings, when 1 year ago he did not know we existed, your ambassador decided that not only were you deserving of our trust, but we were deserving of yours. About your culture and mindset, I know only what I can learn in 1 year, and already your ambassador chose to think that I knew enough to judge you favorably." The ambassador stood, the camera tracking him. The captain and I joined him. The ambassador faced the instant cast and spoke. "He was right. Our greeting lasted a year, humanity. So now let me welcome you to the galaxy." Entry 32. Life has become rather hectic of late. A new human ambassador has been chosen, and the UN is busily streamlining their voting bodies to make it easier to make decisions on behalf of the species, rather than opposing political ideologies. I understand that the process was eased by the discovery of the one responsible for the poisoning of our friend, the former ambassador. He died mere minutes after hearing our decision. I didn't think I would be capable of getting so personally involved in an alien diplomatic affair, but I felt emotionally drained when the diplomat responsible for slipping the poison to the ambassador was caught. Representatives from the other 28 members of the Confederacy that have attained spaceflight have arrived to officially welcome humanity into the greater galaxy. But the UN Security Council was most direct in their demands that our ambassador take point. The negative backlash against the decision to leave the entire species' fate up to the ambassador was disheartening to behold. I understand that entire regions of the planet nearly rose in arms over the human ambassador's choice. I am led to understand that his appointment had not been uncontested, as he was apparently very rich in his own right, and some did not think that he would represent humanity faithfully. I am glad he proved them wrong. Our own ambassador has been the subject of rather angry commentary from the human press of late. Apparently those few moments wherein he looked like he might really drop the asteroid on the planet, and alongside the litany of complaints against humans, including theocratic, were enough to convince some elements of humanity that the choice had been a loaded one. More than a few people in our own staff grumbled that we had been saddled with an unfair burden, now having the responsibility of leading a foreign race by example, and they are not wrong. Entry 33. Still, I can think of worse men to lead by example than one who has had centuries of experience in diplomatic patience and made the correct choice given the opportunity to blunt such an apparently threatening species as humanity. As for myself, I have tabled the recommendation that we use one of our freighters to drag the largest asteroid we can to the orbit of Earth and have it be used to create another of their space platforms, and use that, a truly neutral ground, as the base of operations for future participation in the Confederacy. Certainly, the easily preventable death of their previous ambassador helped to convince the new one of the idea's merit. The galaxy is a convoluted place, and the diplomatic tactics embraced by the humans since we met them, poisoning, ultimatums, etc., whether these are the norm or not, will not be greeted with anything even remotely approaching enthusiasm by the rest of the galaxy. But I am confident that, in time, the rest of the Confederacy shall see as we do, that humanity has a place among equals in the defense and enrichment of the spacefaring people. End Journal.